At my son's luxury wedding, my new daughter-in-law slapped my wife across the face in front of 400 elite guests. She looked down at my wife's bleeding cheek and told her to get out, thinking we were just retired. Nobody's crashing her special day. My son just stood there and watched. He did not know that with one single phone call, I was about to wipe out his entire future, seize her family's estate, and turn their dream wedding into a federal crime scene. I am Franklin Montgomery, 75 years old, and the quiet architect of one of the largest private commercial real estate empires in Atlanta. The sharp crack of skin against skin echoed over the soft jazz playing in the grand ballroom. It was a sound so sudden and violent that it seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the massive room. The jazz band on the stage stopped abruptly. The saxophone player lowered his instrument while the upright bass player slapped his hand over the thick strings to kill the vibration. The sudden silence that followed was heavier than a concrete vault. I was standing 10 feet away, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. When I saw my wife of 50 years, Eleanor Montgomery, stumble backward. Her custom designer glasses slipped from her face and shattered against the imported Italian marble floor. The sound of breaking glass was deafening in the heavy silence that fell over the 400 guests in attendance. Time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. I watched the shards of glass scatter across the floor, reflecting the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above us. I looked at Eleanor. She touched her cheek, where a thin line of deep red blood began to trickle down her dark skin, cut open by the massive diamond engagement ring I had paid for just 6 months ago. Eleanor was 74 years old, but she still carried herself with the grace of a queen. We built our lives from nothing in the harsh streets of the city, working 3 jobs each just to keep the lights on in our tiny apartment decades ago. She was the woman who packed my lunches when I was pouring concrete in the freezing rain, and she was the woman who sat beside me in the boardroom when we made our first million. No one in my entire life had ever dared to raise a hand to her until tonight. Standing over her was Vanessa, my brand new daughter-in-law. She was 26 years old, dressed in a custom silk gown that cost more than most people make in 5 years. Her face, which had been smiling flawlessly for the cameras all evening, was now twisted into an ugly mask of pure arrogant disgust. "Get out of here, old woman." Vanessa spat, her voice ringing clear and sharp through the dead silence of the ballroom. "Nobody wants you here. You are ruining my perfect day." Vanessa came from a family in Charleston that claimed to have old money. They were the kind of people who smiled at you with their teeth, but looked at you like you were dirt on the bottom of their shoes. Vanessa truly believed she was doing my son a favor by marrying him, bringing her supposed high society status to our black family. She thought I was just a retired blue-collar contractor who got lucky with a few modest investments. She thought my wife and I were an embarrassment to her carefully curated aesthetic. She had no idea that the very ground she was standing on, the $5 a night luxury estate, hosting this reception, was owned by a shell company registered entirely in my name. I glanced over at the VIP tables where Vanessa's parents, Lawrence and Victoria Ashford, were seated. They did not look shocked. They did not rush forward to apologize for their daughter's violent, unprovoked outburst. Victoria just took a slow sip of her martini while Lawrence whispered something to the man next to him with a slight smirk on his face. They felt perfectly comfortable watching their daughter humiliate a black woman in public. To them, we were just the people funding the party. We were not equals. We were merely a stepping stone for their bankrupt family to maintain their wealthy facade. My eyes shifted immediately to my son, Brandon Montgomery. He was 28 years old, standing less than 3 feet away from the woman who had just assaulted his mother. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had shielded from the ugly realities of the world. I spent 50 years building an empire so my son would never have to bow his head to anyone. I gave him the best education, the finest clothes, and the most exclusive connections. But in my quest to protect him from hardship, I had accidentally robbed him of his spine. I waited for him to react. I waited for the fire that should be in the belly of any man whose mother has just been struck. I waited for him to step between them, to grab his wife's arm, to demand an apology, and to throw her out of the room. I waited for him to prove that the blood running through his veins was mine, But Brandon did absolutely nothing. He froze. He looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes. He gripped his crystal champagne flute so tightly his knuckles turned white. But he refused to lift his head. He refused to look at his bleeding mother. He refused to look at me. The cowardice rolling off him was a physical stench in the air. He was choosing his side, and he was doing it through his pathetic, terrified silence. He was choosing the illusion of acceptance from this racist, bankrupt family over the mother who had kissed his bruised knees and stayed up all night when he was sick as a child. In that single frozen moment, 28 years of a father's unconditional love evaporated into thin air. It was not replaced by sadness. I did not feel the urge to cry. It was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I realized that my son was not a victim in this marriage. He was a willing accomplice. By standing there doing nothing, he was endorsing the disrespect. He was telling this arrogant little girl that she had permission to treat us like dirt beneath her expensive heels. He was proving that he was entirely unworthy of the legacy I had built for him. I did not shout. I did not rush forward to attack the girl or shake my son by his tailored lapels. Men who build empires from the ground up do not throw tantrums in public. We do not scream and cry and show our enemies our emotional cards. We calculate and we execute. I set the 2 glasses of cider down on a passing waiter's tray with steady, unshakable hands. I walked slowly across the marble floor. The crowd of wealthy elites parted for me like the Red Sea. No one dared to breathe. They just watched the old man walk toward the bride. I knelt down with my old aching joints right in front of Vanessa's expensive white shoes. I carefully picked up the broken pieces of Eleanor's glasses so nobody would step on them. I pulled a clean silk handkerchief from the inside pocket of my tailored suit and gently pressed it to my beautiful wife's cheek, wiping away the line of blood. Eleanor looked at me. Her eyes were not filled with tears. They were perfectly calm. After 50 years of marriage and building a dynasty together from nothing, she knew exactly what was running through my mind. We had a contingency plan for everything in our corporate business, and a few years ago, we made one for our family trust. It was a plan designed to sever the rot if the branch ever became infected. She placed her warm hand over mine and nodded once, a silent, unbreakable agreement between partners. The gloves were off. I stood back up to my full height. I looked directly at Vanessa. She puffed out her chest, crossing her arms and smirking at me. She was waiting for me to yell. She was waiting for the angry black man stereotype to come out, so she could play the fragile victim for her wealthy white relatives who were watching from the VIP tables. She wanted me to cause a scene so she could have security throw us out of our own son's wedding. I gave her absolutely nothing. My face was a mask of pure stone. I looked at Brandon, who finally managed to meet my gaze for a fraction of a second before his eyes darted away in utter shame. I did not say a single word to him. I did not need to. He was already a ghost to me. He was no longer my heir. He was just a stranger in a suit that I had paid for. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a private encrypted number that went straight to my lead wealth manager. He is a man who is paid very well to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It rang only one time before he answered. I kept my eyes locked on Vanessa's smug face as I spoke 3 simple words into the receiver. Execute Directive 0. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Vanessa let out a condescending little laugh, clearly thinking I was just an old man trying to sound important to save face in front of her high society friends. She thought I was ordering a taxi to take my wife home, but her laugh died in her throat a few seconds later. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed loudly through the massive hall. The heavy oak double doors leading out of the grand ballroom had just slammed shut, and the electronic deadbolts locked from the outside. The green exit signs above the doors turned red. No one was leaving. The game had just begun. 10 seconds passed after the heavy oak doors locked shut. Vanessa was still standing there with that arrogant smirk on her face, completely unaware that the ground beneath her expensive silk shoes was about to crumble. Then it happened. The grand ballroom plunged into absolute darkness. The romantic jazz music that had just started playing again was cut off mid-note, leaving a sickening mechanical hum in the air. The 400 elite guests gasped in unison. A wave of panic rippled through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. They were the wealthiest people in Atlanta and Charleston, and they were not used to being kept in the dark. 5 seconds later, the emergency lights kicked on. They were not the warm golden lights of the crystal chandeliers that had bathed the room in a soft, romantic glow all evening. These were harsh, blinding industrial H halogen beams, the kind of lights you see in a prison courtyard or a warehouse loading dock. They cast ugly, sharp shadows across the faces of the socialites, making their expensive makeup look cheap and their panicked expressions look grotesque. The illusion of the perfect high society wedding was instantly shattered. It was replaced by the cold, hard reality of a lockdown. Vanessa spun around in a circle, looking up at the ceiling in pure confusion. Her perfect aesthetic was ruined. She demanded to know what was going on, waving her hands at the waiters who had suddenly stopped serving champagne. Brandon, my pathetic son, looked just as lost. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The venue was equipped with signal jammers for high-security corporate events, and Directive Zero had just activated them all. We were completely isolated from the outside world, and I was the only man in the room holding the remote control. From the shadows near the catering kitchen, the venue manager stepped forward. His name was Gerald. He was a highly trained professional who had worked for my private management firm for 10 years. He walked with a stiff military posture, holding a wireless microphone. The harsh halogen lights reflected off his bald head. He did not look at the bride or the groom. He did not look at the screaming guests. He looked directly at me. I gave him a fraction of a nod. Gerald tapped the microphone twice. The heavy thud echoed through the massive speakers, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gerald said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of emotion, "may I have your immediate attention? Please remain calm. Due to an instant and catastrophic payment failure, all services for this event have been legally terminated. The catering staff, the musicians, and the hospitality crew are now off the clock. This private property is now officially closed. You have exactly 10 minutes to evacuate the premises before the local authorities arrive to arrest anyone remaining for criminal trespassing. Please proceed to the exits in an orderly fashion." The silence that followed his announcement was absolute. No one breathed. Then the room exploded into chaos. Women in diamond necklaces shrieked. Men in custom suits began shouting at the staff. Vanessa stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, her jaw practically hitting the marble. She grabbed Brandon's arm and shook him, demanding that he fix this immediately. She screamed at him to call the bank, to throw his platinum credit card at the manager, to do whatever it took to save her perfect night. But Brandon just stared at his wallet, knowing deep down that every piece of plastic inside it was tied to the empire I built, and I had just burned it all to the ground. Vanessa had made a fatal miscalculation when she decided to marry my son. She looked at me and saw an old black man who worked with his hands. She knew I had started out as a blue-collar contractor decades ago, pouring concrete and fixing roofs in the blistering Georgia heat. She assumed I was just a lucky retiree who managed to save enough pennies to put my son through a good school. She thought she was the one bringing prestige to this family with her empty Charleston pedigree. She did not know that the concrete I poured became the foundation of a real estate monopoly. She did not know that the holding company she wrote the $5,000 a night check to for this luxury estate was just one of 30 shell companies I owned. I owned the manicured lawn she walked on. I owned the crystal chandeliers hanging above her head. I owned the very marble floor where she had just shattered my wife's glasses. When she insisted on booking this exact estate for her wedding because it was the most exclusive venue in the state, I did not say a word. I let her sign the contract. I let her feel powerful. I wanted to see how she would behave when she thought she held all the cards. Tonight she showed her true colors, and she walked right into a steel trap that I had built with my own 2 hands. Through the panicked crowd, 2 figures pushed their way forward with violent entitlement. It was Lawrence and Victoria, Vanessa's wealthy white parents. Lawrence's face was red and veins bulged in his neck. Victoria looked like a cornered animal clutching her pearl necklace. They ignored the fact that my wife was standing next to me, pressing a bloody silk handkerchief to her face. They ignored the fact that their daughter had just committed a violent assault. All they cared about was their public image and the humiliation of being kicked out of a venue in front of their country club friends. Lawrence marched right up to me and shoved his finger inches from my face. "Listen to me, you old fool," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I do not know what kind of cheap stunt you think you are pulling here, but I will personally see to it that you are ruined. You are embarrassing my family. You are destroying my daughter's wedding. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. I will sue you for every dime you have hidden in your little retirement fund. I will drag you through the courts until you are living on the street." Victoria joined in her voice, a high-pitched screech that cut through the noise of the evacuating guests. "Fix this right now," she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Go tell that manager to turn the lights back on and serve the food. You people are always ruining everything with your dramatic outbursts. Tell your wife to stop crying and go wash her face in the bathroom so we can get on with the evening. You people." The words hung in the air, dripping with generations of unearned arrogance. They truly believed that, because their ancestors had money, they were untouchable. They believed that they could bark orders at me, and I would simply bow my head and obey, just like my son had done. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that Lawrence was currently drowning in $15 million of corporate debt to keep up this pathetic wealthy facade. They were screaming at the man who secretly owned the mortgage to their ancestral home. But I did not smile. I did not tell them who I really was, not yet. The psychological torture had to be administered in precise doses to be effective. I looked at Lawrence. I looked at Victoria. I let the silence stretch between us, letting their angry words echo off the cold walls. I wanted them to remember this exact moment later when they were standing in front of a bankruptcy judge. I wanted them to remember the moment they tried to intimidate a man who could buy and sell their entire bloodline before breakfast. I did not blink. I did not flinch away from Lawrence's pointing finger. I simply looked through him as if he were made of glass. I turned my back on the most powerful man in Charleston without uttering a single word. I placed my arm gently around Eleanor's waist, pulling her close to my side. She was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the moment. She kept her head held high, refusing to let these people see her break. We began to walk toward the heavy oak doors, which Gerald had just unlocked to let the panicked herd of guests escape into the night. As we walked away, I could hear Lawrence screaming behind me. He was shouting that I was a coward, that I was running away. Then I heard him yell to his wife to get his phone. He was dialing 911. He was calling the police to report me for ruining the wedding. He wanted me arrested for fraud. I kept walking my arm tight around the woman I loved more than life itself. Lawrence had no idea that calling the police was exactly what I wanted him to do. The trap was set, the doors were open, and the predators were about to become the prey. The drive away from the estate was completely silent. The heavy rain beat against the tinted windows of my town car, washing away the remnants of what was supposed to be a night of celebration. I sat in the back seat next to Eleanor, holding her hand. She still had my silk handkerchief pressed firmly against her right cheek. The bleeding had slowed, but the cut from Vanessa's massive diamond ring was deep. I told my driver to skip our estate and head directly to the emergency room at Emory University Hospital in downtown Atlanta. Eleanor looked at me with a tired but understanding expression. She knew exactly why we were going there. We were not going to the hospital simply to get a bandage or some pain medication. We were going there to build a weapon. In the state of Georgia, the law is very clear. If you strike a 74-year-old woman, you are not just committing a simple battery. You are committing a felony. It is classified as elder abuse. Rich white families like Vanessa are used to making their problems disappear with a few phone calls and a fat check. They think they can slap a black woman and just walk away because they assume we do not have the resources to fight back. But a certified medical report from an emergency room doctor detailing an unprovoked assault on a senior citizen is a piece of paper that no amount of old money can erase. We walked into the brightly lit emergency room. The harsh fluorescent lights were a sharp contrast to the elegant darkness of the wedding venue. The nurses immediately took us into a private examination room when they saw the blood on Eleanor's face and the expensive clothes we were wearing. A young doctor came in to clean the wound. He asked what happened. I did not sugarcoat it. I did not try to protect my son's new bride. I looked the doctor right in the eye and told him that my wife was intentionally struck in the face by a 26-year-old woman named Vanessa. I made sure he wrote down the exact name and the exact circumstances in his official medical chart. I stood in the corner of the small sterile room and watched as a forensic nurse took high-resolution photographs of the laceration on Eleanor's cheek. They documented the bruising that was already beginning to form around her jaw. Every flash of the camera was another nail in Vanessa's coffin. I was meticulously laying the groundwork for a criminal prosecution that would completely destroy her life. I wanted every piece of evidence locked down before her bankrupt father, Ivan, had a chance to hire a lawyer to spin a false narrative. Once the doctor finished stitching the cut and handing us the official paperwork, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was a call from Brandon. I looked at the caller ID and felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me. My son had not checked on his mother once since the incident. He had not called to see if she was bleeding, if she was hurt, or if she was even safe. Instead, he was calling me because his carefully constructed world of unearned luxury was finally starting to fall apart. I stepped out of the hospital room into the quiet hallway and answered the call. I did not say hello. I just listened to the panic in his voice. Brandon was standing at the Delta terminal in Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. He and his new bride were supposed to be boarding a flight for their 3-week honeymoon in the Maldives. It was a trip that cost more than most people earn in an entire year. And I was the one who had paid for every single cent of it. But now he was shouting into the phone, out of breath and frantic. He demanded to know what was going on. He said they had just tried to enter the exclusive VIP lounge, and the attendant had cut his membership card in half right in front of him. He was furious. He told me that when they got to the ticketing counter, the agent informed them that their first-class tickets to the Maldives had been completely canceled, and the reservation was wiped from the system. He was throwing a massive tantrum in the middle of the busiest airport in the world. He told me that Vanessa was crying next to him and that people were staring at them. He demanded that I call the airline right now to fix the glitch. He actually used the word glitch. He was so incredibly entitled that he could not even comprehend the concept of a consequence. He thought the universe had simply made a mistake. I let him scream and complain for 2 full minutes. I listened to his pathetic whining while I looked through the glass window of the hospital door, watching my beautiful wife hold an ice pack to her bruised face. When he finally stopped talking to take a breath, I spoke. My voice was quiet and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I told him there was no glitch. I told him that I had personally canceled the honeymoon flights while we were riding in the car to the hospital. Brandon went dead silent on the other end of the line. Then he started to stammer, asking me why I would do such a thing on his wedding night. I explained it to him very simply. I told him that the black corporate American Express card in his wallet, the one he used to fund his entire lavish lifestyle, was officially dead. The account was permanently closed. I told him that his trust fund was frozen and his access to any family accounts had been entirely revoked. I told him that the moment he stood by and watched a spoiled, arrogant little girl assault his mother, he ceased to be a part of my family, and people who are not part of my family do not get to spend my money. His shock quickly turned into a violent, desperate rage. He started yelling again, but this time his voice was cracking. He told me I was being unreasonable and crazy over a stupid argument. He actually called the unprovoked assault on his mother a stupid argument. He said I was ruining his life and humiliating his wife. He threatened me, telling me that he did not need my money anyway. He screamed that they would just get an Uber and go back to his luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta to figure things out in the morning. He told me I would regret this when they cut me out of their lives forever. I did not argue with him. I did not try to teach him a lesson or explain the depth of my disappointment. He was far beyond saving. A man who defends the person who drew his mother's blood is a man who deserves to lose everything. So, I gave him the only response his disrespect warranted. Total and absolute silence. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call right in the middle of his angry ranting. I blocked his number immediately, let him scream into the void. I walked back into the hospital room and put my phone away. Eleanor looked at me and I simply nodded. She knew the cord had been cut. There is a profound kind of grief that comes with realizing your child is fundamentally broken. I had spent 28 years trying to mold him into a leader, a man of substance and character. But as I helped Eleanor put her coat back on, I accepted the hard truth. I had raised a parasite, and the only way to deal with a parasite is to completely sever its food supply. We walked out of the emergency room and stepped back into the cold, rainy Atlanta night. My driver opened the door for us, and we slid into the quiet sanctuary of the car. I instructed him to take us home to our estate in Buckhead. As the city lights blurred past the windows, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. For years, I had been carrying the weight of Brandon's incompetence. I had been quietly fixing his mistakes, covering his massive credit card bills, and ignoring the glaring flaws in his character, because I wanted to believe he would eventually mature. Tonight, Vanessa had done me a massive favor. By slapping my wife, she had shattered the illusion once and for all. She forced me to wake up and see the ugly reality of who my son truly was. They thought they had won. They thought they could take my money and walk all over my blood. But they were playing checkers while I was moving the final pieces on a chessboard they did not even know existed. While my car drove smoothly toward the safety of our gated estate, I pulled out my tablet to check the security network. Brandon was arrogant and stupid, but he was also predictable. Just as he had threatened, he and Vanessa had taken a rideshare from the airport straight to the ultra-modern high-rise building in Midtown Atlanta, where his penthouse was located. He called it his penthouse, but his name was nowhere on the deed. It belonged to my real estate portfolio, and it was fully integrated into my corporate security system. I opened the live feed from the security camera, positioned right outside the front door of the penthouse. The high-definition video showed Brandon and Vanessa stepping out of the elevator. They looked exhausted, wet from the rain and thoroughly miserable. Vanessa was carrying her heavy wedding dress in her arms, mascara running down her face. Brandon marched up to the sleek black door, looking furious. He reached out to place his thumb on the biometric fingerprint scanner, expecting the door to slide open and welcome him into his multi-million-dollar sanctuary. He pressed his thumb against the glass pad. The scanner beeped a sharp, harsh tone. The circular light around the scanner did not turn its usual welcoming green. Instead, it flashed a bright, angry red. Access denied. Brandon frowned and wiped his thumb on his shirt, thinking the scanner was just dirty. He pressed it again. Another harsh beep, another red light. He tried his index finger, red. He tried typing his emergency backup code into the glowing keypad. The screen flashed the word "Security Lockout" in bold white letters. I sat in the back of my town car watching the live feed with a cold, steady heart as my son finally realized the terrible truth. He was locked out of his home, locked out of his wealth, and locked out of his future. The real nightmare had just begun. The rain was still pouring down on the city of Atlanta when my security team sent the first alert to my secure tablet. My son and his new bride had been completely locked out of the luxury penthouse in Midtown. With his corporate credit cards permanently deactivated and his bank accounts frozen, they had nowhere to go. They were forced to take a cheap rideshare to a rundown motel right off the interstate. It was a stark contrast to the $5,000 a night estate they had just been evicted from. I imagined Vanessa sitting in that damp, cheap motel room, wearing a custom silk wedding gown that was now ruined by the rain and dirt. A smart person would have taken that moment to reflect on their mistakes and beg for forgiveness. But Vanessa was not smart. She was arrogant, and she possessed a dangerous kind of privilege that made her believe she could never truly lose. Instead of reflecting, she pulled out her phone and decided to go to war. By 2 in the morning, a video was uploaded to her social media account. I sat in the quiet darkness of my study, watching the screen as the video played. Vanessa was sitting on the edge of a cheap motel bed. Her expensive makeup was intentionally smudged to make her look like a victim. She looked directly into the camera and forced her eyes to fill with tears. Her voice trembled perfectly as she began to weave a narrative built entirely on lies. She told her millions of followers that her perfect wedding day had been destroyed by an aggressive and unhinged mother-in-law. She used all the classic coded language that society has always used to demonize black women. She claimed that my wife had been hostile to her from the very beginning because of her race and her wealthy background. She looked into the lens and cried, saying that Eleanor had cornered her and attacked her, forcing Vanessa to act in pure self-defense to protect herself. She painted herself as the fragile, innocent bride who had just barely escaped a violent family. It was a masterful performance of weaponized victimhood. Within an hour, the video had gone completely viral. The internet loves a tragic story, especially when it features a crying young woman claiming she was wronged. I watched the view count climb into the millions. The comment section beneath the video turned into an absolute cesspool of hatred. Complete strangers who knew absolutely nothing about our lives began launching vicious racial and ageist attacks against my wife. They called Eleanor a bitter old woman. They used degrading terms implying she was jealous of her beautiful young daughter-in-law. They said she belonged in a cage. They demanded that Vanessa press charges against the violent thugs who ruined her wedding. I did not get angry as I read those comments. Anger is a useless emotion that clouds your judgment. Instead, I felt a deep, freezing calm settle over my mind. They were attacking a 74-year-old woman who had spent her entire life building communities and funding charities. But the public did not care about the truth. They only cared about the spectacle. Then I saw the one thing that finally killed the last remaining shred of fatherly love I had in my heart. Pinned right at the top of the comment section, under the hateful video, was a message from my son. Brandon had used his verified account to leave a public reply for the entire world to see. He wrote that he stood by his wife. He wrote that nobody should ever have to endure the kind of abuse Vanessa suffered on her wedding day. I stared at those words for a very long time. My son, the boy I had raised to be a king, had publicly sided with the woman who struck his mother. He chose to validate a racist lie rather than stand up for the woman who gave him life. He was actively participating in the public lynching of his own mother's character. In that exact moment, Brandon died to me. Any thought of future rehabilitation or forgiveness was permanently erased from my mind. He was no longer a disappointed son, he was an active enemy. What the millions of people watching that video did not know was the real reason behind the altercation. They did not know what happened in the luxurious bridal suite just 1 hour before the wedding reception began. Eleanor had gone up to the suite alone. She had brought a velvet box containing a vintage diamond necklace that had been in our family for decades. It was meant to be a welcoming gift for Vanessa to show her that, despite our differences, she was now part of our family. When Eleanor quietly opened the door to the bridal suite, she did not find a nervous bride getting ready. She found Vanessa sitting at the expensive mahogany vanity mirror with 3 of her wealthy bridesmaids. Spread across the glass surface of the mirror was a pile of white powder. Vanessa was holding a tightly rolled $100 bill to her nose, snorting cocaine right before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway. But the drugs were not even the worst part of what she witnessed. Vanessa was laughing loudly with her friends. She was bragging about the prenuptial agreement our corporate lawyers had forced her to sign. Vanessa told her bridesmaids that she had hired her own secret lawyer to review the prenuptial agreement infidelity clause, which was designed to strip her of everything if she was unfaithful or abusive. She boasted that they had found a massive loophole in the trust fund stipulations. She laughed and said she only had to endure being married to my pathetic son for exactly 1 year. After 12 months, she claimed she could trigger a divorce clause that would entitle her to half of the $50 million trust fund. She referred to Brandon as a stupid meal ticket and called our family a bunch of gullible fools who were desperate for white validation. My wife heard every single word. Eleanor did not scream and she did not throw a fit. She walked calmly into the room and placed the velvet box on the table. Vanessa froze, dropping the rolled-up bill when she realized she had been caught. Eleanor looked her right in the eye. She told Vanessa to wash her face, pack her bags, and leave the estate immediately. She promised that if Vanessa walked out the back door quietly, we would handle the cancellation of the wedding with dignity and keep her drug use a secret. But Vanessa was high on cocaine and drunk on her own arrogance. She thought she was untouchable. Instead of leaving, she fixed her makeup, put on her smile, and marched down to the grand ballroom to force the wedding to continue. When Eleanor approached her later on the dance floor to quietly demand that she stop the charade, Vanessa panicked. Realizing her massive payday was about to slip through her fingers, she decided to strike first. She slapped my wife in front of 400 people to create a chaotic distraction, hoping to spin the narrative exactly as she was doing now on social media. She thought her plan was working flawlessly. She thought the viral video would pressure us into giving her whatever she wanted to make the public relations nightmare go away. She thought we were soft billionaires who would pay any price to protect our corporate image. She did not realize that I had spent the last 40 years swimming with sharks, and I knew exactly how to bleed a predator dry. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a pale light over our estate. Eleanor was resting quietly in the master bedroom. I was sitting at the massive oak desk in my private office, reviewing the digital footprint of every single shell company tied to Vanessa's family. The intercom on my desk buzzed softly. My head of security informed me that a vehicle had just pulled up to the main security gate. I authorized them to let the vehicle through. 5 minutes later, my lead corporate lawyer walked into my office. He was a ruthless man who rarely showed emotion. But this morning, he had a tight, rigid look on his face. He walked over to my desk and placed a thick stack of legal documents right in front of me. He told me that Vanessa and her bankrupt father had not wasted a single second. They had hired a sleazy, high-profile litigator known for public smear campaigns. The documents on my desk were a formally drafted lawsuit. Vanessa was suing me and my wife for $10 million, claiming severe emotional distress, public humiliation, and false imprisonment due to the doors being locked at the venue. The lawsuit included a demand for an immediate settlement, warning that if we did not pay, the viral video would just be the beginning of a massive media tour to destroy my corporate empire. I looked down at the ridiculous legal papers, a $10 million extortion attempt wrapped in a civil lawsuit. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought the threat of public ruin would force me to open my vault and hand them a fortune. I slowly reached out and tapped my fingers against the thick stack of paper. A cold, genuine smile finally spread across my face. They had taken the bait perfectly. The lawsuit gave me the exact legal excuse I needed to open the vault. But they were not going to find any money inside. They were only going to find their absolute destruction. The meeting was set for 10. The following morning, at the downtown offices of my primary legal counsel. My corporate lawyer, Mr. Sinclair, was a man who possessed the warmth of a great white shark and the precision of a military sniper. His office was located on the 50th floor of a towering glass skyscraper that I happened to own through a subsidiary holding company. The room was entirely soundproofed, featuring a massive mahogany conference table and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I sat alone at the head of the table in a high-backed leather chair. Eleanor was safely at home, resting in our quiet garden. I did not want her to breathe the same air as the people who were about to walk through those heavy oak doors. I wanted to handle this execution myself. At exactly 10:15, the heavy glass doors swung open. They were 15 minutes late. A cheap power play designed to make me angry. Vanessa and Brandon marched into the room, flanked by a man who looked like he belonged on a late-night television commercial. He was their newly hired litigator, wearing a flashy pinstriped suit, too much cologne, and an arrogant smile. Vanessa looked entirely different from the crying, broken victim she had portrayed on social media just hours before. She was wearing a tailored designer dress, carrying a luxury leather handbag, and projecting an air of absolute triumph. She thought she had me backed into a corner. She thought her viral video and her $10 million lawsuit were the ultimate weapons that would force me to surrender. Brandon walked in right behind her, looking down at the polished floor, just like he did at the wedding. He pulled out a chair for his wife and sat down beside her, refusing to make eye contact with me. He looked exhausted and terrified, But he was still foolish enough to follow her lead. He still believed that his status as my only son would protect him from utter ruin. The sleazy litigator did not even bother to introduce himself properly. He dropped a thick leather briefcase onto the mahogany table and leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the polished wood. He spoke with a loud, obnoxious voice that echoed in the quiet room, trying to dominate the physical space. He told me that his clients were willing to make the entire public relations nightmare go away right now. He said they were deeply traumatized by the events at the wedding and the emotional distress my wife had supposedly inflicted upon Vanessa. He stated that the $10 million lawsuit would be officially dropped and the viral internet video deleted if we simply agreed to their very reasonable terms. Their terms were not a structured payment plan. Their terms were an immediate dissolution of Brandon's trust fund. Vanessa crossed her legs and smiled at me across the table, a look of pure, unadulterated greed flashing in her eyes. She demanded that we unlock the $50 million trust fund that Brandon was supposedly entitled to receive upon his marriage. She explicitly detailed how the money would be divided. She said that $10 million would go directly to her as a tax-free settlement for her suffering. The remaining $40 million would be transferred into a joint account for her and Brandon to start their new life away from our toxic, abusive family. She actually used the word toxic. She sat there in a building I owned, demanding $50 million of my hard-earned money because she had assaulted my wife and played the victim on the internet. I did not say a single word. I did not lean forward or show any sign of intimidation. I did not even blink. I simply looked at Mr. Sinclair, who was sitting completely still to my right. Men with real power do not need to raise their voices to win an argument. We let the paperwork do the screaming. Sinclair adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and picked up a single manila folder from his immaculate desk. He did not open his briefcase. He did not pull out stacks of defense files or counter lawsuits. He only had that one thin folder. Mr. Sinclair slid the folder slowly across the smooth mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of the flashy litigator. The sound of the paper sliding across the wood was the only noise in the room. Sinclair spoke in a voice so calm and quiet that the other lawyer had to lean in to hear him. Sinclair informed them that they were operating under a massive and highly embarrassing delusion. He told Vanessa that she had married a man based on a fundamental misunderstanding of wealth architecture. The litigator opened the folder and began to read. Vanessa leaned over his shoulder, her smug smile faltering slightly as her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. Mr. Sinclair explained it to them in plain English, making sure every word cut deep. He said that Brandon did not own a $50 million trust fund. Brandon did not own a single cent of the family wealth. The trust fund was established decades ago as a fully discretionary generation-skipping trust. Sinclair clarified what that meant. Brandon was merely a discretionary beneficiary. That meant he had absolutely no legal right to demand a single payout ever. Every dollar Brandon had ever spent, every sports car he had ever driven, and every luxury apartment he had ever lived in was granted purely at the discretion of the trustees, and the sole trustees of that massive account were myself and Eleanor. We held the keys to the kingdom, and Brandon was nothing more than a peasant who had been allowed to sleep in the castle. The law was absolute. Brandon could not force a payout. He could not borrow against the principal. He could not pledge the assets to a bank, and he certainly could not hand it over to a greedy bride who thought she had outsmarted a man who built an empire from concrete and steel. I watched the color drain completely out of Brandon's face. He began to breathe heavily. He had spent his entire adult life bragging to his friends and his new wife about his massive trust fund. He had paraded around Atlanta high society acting like a billionaire when in reality he was just a dependent living on an allowance that could be revoked at any second. He had sold Vanessa a fantasy and now the bill was due. Vanessa turned to look at Brandon with wide, angry eyes. The illusion of her grand payday was shattering before her very eyes. She realized in that exact moment that the golden goose she thought she had trapped was actually completely Peniel's. The $50 million she had built her entire future around the money she had snorted drugs and bragged about in the bridal suite was locked inside a vault that she could never force open. She had thrown away her reputation and committed a felony for a man who had zero financial power. But Vanessa was like a rat trapped in a corner. She possessed a dangerous level of arrogance that refused to accept defeat. The shock on her face quickly twisted back into a mask of pure venom. She slammed her hand down on the heavy wooden table and glared at Mr. Sinclair. She laughed a harsh, grating sound that filled the silent room. She told my lawyer that he was bluffing, and that she was not some uneducated girl who could be intimidated by fancy corporate words. She turned her attention back to her litigator and demanded that he explain the real law to us. Vanessa proudly proclaimed that it did not matter if the trust was discretionary. She said that she and Brandon were legally married now. She brought up community property laws and marital asset division, acting as if she had suddenly become an expert in family law overnight. She insisted that since the trust was established for Brandon's benefit the moment they signed their marriage license, she became legally entitled to a portion of its disbursements to maintain her marital standard of living. She threatened to drag the trust into a massive, messy divorce settlement. She claimed she would force a family court judge to order a massive payout based on the lifestyle she was promised. Her sleazy lawyer nodded along, trying to regain his footing after being completely blindsided. He had likely taken this case on a contingency fee, expecting a quick multi-million-dollar settlement from a terrified family trying to protect their public image. Now he was staring down the barrel of a long, drawn-out legal war against a billionaire with unlimited resources. But he puffed out his chest and stated that a judge would not look kindly upon a wealthy family hoarding assets while leaving a young newlywed couple destitute, especially after a highly publicized physical altercation. They thought they had found a loophole. They thought that by weaponizing the family court system, they could force my hand and pry the vault open through sheer public pressure and legal attrition. I looked at my son, who was now sweating profusely, staring at the manila folder as if it were a loaded gun. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake, but he was too paralyzed by fear to speak. Vanessa, on the other hand, was still smirking, believing her community property argument was the winning checkmate. She thought she had outmaneuvered the old man. I gave Mr. Sinclair another slow, deliberate nod. The game was over. It was time to spring the final trap and watch the steel jaws snap shut around their entire future. Mr. Sinclair did not argue with their legal theories. He did not raise his voice or tell them they were wrong about community property. He simply reached across the table and flipped the heavy legal document to page 47. He tapped his expensive gold fountain pen twice against a specific paragraph highlighted in bold black ink. He looked directly into Vanessa's arrogant eyes and told her that community property laws did not apply to a beneficiary who had just triggered the ironclad clause. Mr. Sinclair did not blink when Vanessa threw her ridiculous community property argument across the heavy mahogany table. He did not raise his voice to argue with a woman who clearly possessed more arrogance than actual legal knowledge. He simply sat there with the terrifying calm of a man who held all the winning cards. He did not need to shout. He let the silence stretch out, allowing her unearned confidence to hang in the cold air-conditioned room before he completely destroyed it. Section 8 of the Family Trust Agreement was a provision I had personally insisted upon when my real estate empire first crossed the billion-dollar mark. I grew up in a harsh world where money routinely tore families apart. I watched greed turn brothers into bitter enemies and children into ungrateful parasites. Eleanor and I had promised each other that the wealth we built from the ground up, working multiple jobs and sacrificing our youth, would never be used to fund our own destruction. We instructed our legal team to draft a poison pill into the very foundation of the trust fund. It was a fail-safe mechanism designed to completely sever the financial artery if the beneficiary ever proved themselves unworthy of our legacy. Mr. Sinclair smoothed the heavy parchment paper with his hands. He looked directly at Vanessa's sleazy litigator and told him to listen very carefully to the exact wording on page 47. Sinclair began to read aloud, his steady voice echoing off the glass walls of the high-rise boardroom. He read Section 8, the morality clause. The legal language was absolute and unforgiving. It stated that any physical or psychological harm inflicted upon the Greenchers, meaning myself and Eleanor, by a beneficiary or their legally wedded spouse, would result in instantaneous and permanent disinheritance. Sinclair did not stop there. He continued reading the precise stipulations of the clause, ensuring they understood the gravity of their situation. The document mandated that the moment an act of aggression was documented, the beneficiary would be completely stripped of all current and future access to the trust assets. There was no grace period. There was no mandatory arbitration required to prove intent. There was no board of trustees vote needed to enforce the penalty. The disinheritance was triggered automatically the exact second Vanessa raised her hand and struck my wife in front of 400 witnesses. The silence that blanketed the boardroom was so profound you could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system above us. The flashy litigator who had marched into my building demanding $10 million just moments ago was suddenly completely speechless. He stared at the manila folder as if it had magically transformed into a venomous snake. He knew exactly what that clause meant. Any competent lawyer would know that a generation-skipping discretionary trust fortified with a strict morality clause is virtually impenetrable. Vanessa, however, was not a lawyer. She was a spoiled child who had spent her entire life manipulating people to get what she wanted. She looked back and forth between Mr. Sinclair and her own attorney, waiting for someone to object. When her attorney remained silent, she let out a loud scoff of disbelief. She leaned across the table and told Mr. Sinclair that a piece of paper could not just magically erase her husband's money. She reiterated her flawed belief that she was protected by marital rights. She arrogantly told my lawyer that her father would tie this up in family court for the next 10 years if he had to. Mr. Sinclair adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at her with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. He calmly explained to her that her attempt to extort the family trust and her husband's collusion in siphoning trust assets constituted elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code 15-6-2030, given that the assets were designated to support our retirement and elder care. Furthermore, Sinclair revealed that they had obtained documents showing Vanessa and her parents had attempted to forge my signature on financial authorization forms, a clear violation of California Penal Code, Section 470 forgery, Kinjauzik void ab initio, meaning any such transaction was legally null and void from the very beginning. He calmly explained to her that she could not tie up assets that no longer existed. He told her that as of midnight on the evening of the wedding, all accounts associated with Brandon had been legally dissolved and absorbed back into the primary corporate holding company. Sinclair pointed out that the official medical report from Emory University Hospital documenting the felony assault on Eleanor had already been formally filed and attached to the trust dissolution papers. The legal requirements for the morality clause had been met flawlessly. The litigator sitting next to Vanessa slowly began to close his leather briefcase. He had taken this case expecting a quick and easy payday from an old man trying to avoid a public scandal. Now he realized he had walked into a legal slaughterhouse. He knew that fighting a morality clause backed by a documented emergency room visit and 400 eyewitnesses was a completely unwinnable battle. Furthermore, he realized that the wealthy young couple he was representing had absolutely no money to pay his exorbitant hourly legal fees. He clicked the brass locks on his briefcase shut and pushed his chair back from the table, preparing to abandon a sinking ship. Vanessa watched her attorney backing away, and genuine panic finally began to claw at her throat. The smug, victorious smile that had been plastered on her face, and she walked into the building completely melted away. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. She turned her head slowly and looked at Brandon. My son was sitting completely paralyzed in his high-backed leather chair. The terrifying reality of his situation was finally crushing him under its immense weight. For 28 years, Brandon had lived safely inside a protective bubble of limitless wealth. He had never applied for a mortgage. He had never worried about paying a credit card bill. He had never even held a real job. His entire identity was wrapped up in the fact that he was the golden heir to my massive real estate empire. He wore bespoke suits, drove imported Italian sports cars, and threw thousands of dollars away on expensive champagne just to impress his shallow friends. But underneath all the expensive clothes and the unearned arrogance, Brandon was absolutely nothing. He had no real-world skills to fall back on. He had no professional network outside of the people who were only using him for my money. He was just a weak, pathetic boy who had stood by and watched his mother bleed because he was too much of a coward to stand up to his spoiled bride. And now, because of that exact cowardice, he had lost the one thing that made him valuable to the woman sitting next to him. I sat at the head of the table and watched my son hyperventilate. His chest was heaving, and heavy beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. He looked across the massive table at me, his eyes wide with pure terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to beg for a second chance. He wanted to tell me that it was all a big mistake and that he truly loved his mother. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not glare at him in anger. I did not smile triumphantly at his ruin. I simply looked at him with the cold, indifferent stare of a man looking at a complete stranger on the street. Vanessa was watching him, too. I could see the gears turning violently inside her head as she processed the catastrophic shift in her reality. She had spent months plotting and scheming behind our backs. She had endured what she considered to be a degrading relationship with a black man just so she could secure her luxurious financial future. She had snorted cocaine in the bridal suite and bragged to her friends about the millions she was going to extract from our gullible family. She had slapped an elderly woman in public and launched a viral smear campaign on the internet, all to force my hand and secure her payout, and it had all been for absolutely nothing. She had not married a billionaire heir. She had married a broke, unemployed man with no access to housing, no credit cards, and no future. She was legally bound to a massive liability. The $50 million payday she had dreamed of was gone forever, locked away behind an impenetrable legal wall that she could never breach. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Her face turned pale, making the heavy makeup around her eyes look harsh and unnatural. The grand illusion of her high society superiority shattered right there in my corporate boardroom. She was a woman drowning in debt from a bankrupt family, and she had just legally tied herself to a man who could not even afford to buy her a cup of cheap coffee. The silence in the room stretched on, becoming thick and suffocating. Vanessa's breathing became fast and erratic. She slowly stood up from her chair, her designer dress rustling loudly in the quiet room. She did not look at me. She did not look at Mr. Sinclair or her fleeing attorney. She turned her entire body toward my son. The transition was immediate and terrifying to witness. The fragile woman, who had just posted a crying video on the internet claiming she loved her husband and was defending their sacred marriage, completely vanished. The victim mask fell off, revealing the vicious, calculating predator underneath. All the anger, all the public humiliation, and all the crushing disappointment that she was feeling instantly locked onto Brandon. She looked down at him, sitting there sweating and terrified, and her eyes narrowed into dark slits of pure hatred. She realized that he had known about the discretionary nature of the trust all along. She realized that he had lied to her about his level of control over the money just to get her to marry him. He had played the role of a powerful billionaire, but he was nothing more than an obedient lapdog who had just been kicked out of the house. Vanessa clenched her fists at her sides until her knuckles turned white. She leaned down, placing her hands on the armrest of his chair, trapping him. Her face was only inches away from Andreas' sweating forehead. The boardroom was perfectly silent, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The trap I had set had worked flawlessly. I did not have to raise my voice or lift a single finger to destroy them. I simply removed the money and let their own toxic greed tear them apart from the inside. Vanessa took a deep, ragged breath, preparing to unleash hell on the man she had sworn to love just 48 hours ago. Vanessa stormed out of the boardroom, leaving her flashy litigator behind. She did not wait for Brandon. She marched to the elevator, her designer heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. Brandon stumbled after her like a lost dog. He was completely numb. The $50 million he thought was his birthright was gone forever. When they reached the ground floor, the reality of their situation hit them like a heavy freight train. They had no car to take them home. Brandon's black corporate credit card was dead. Vanessa had to use her own nearly maxed-out personal credit card to call a cheap rideshare. They stood on the busy sidewalk in the humid Atlanta heat, waiting for a battered sedan to pick them up. It was a humiliating downgrade for a couple who had flown exclusively on private jets just a week prior. Vanessa sat in the back of the cheap car, biting her nails as her mind raced to find a way out of the massive hole she had dug for herself. She told the driver to take them to the Piedmont Elite Country Club. It was the oldest and most exclusive private club in the city, a place where her parents, Lawrence and Victoria, spent every single afternoon drinking expensive gin and networking with other bankrupt aristocrats. Vanessa believed that her family name would save her. She believed her father would simply write a massive check to fix the problem and provide her with the luxury she deserved. She dragged Brandon along, not out of love or loyalty, but because he was the only piece of leverage she had left. The drive to the country club took 45 minutes. The silence in the back of the car was suffocating and heavy. Brandon stared out the window, watching the city he used to own pass him by. He was a prince who had just been exiled from his own kingdom. Vanessa did not even look at him. She was aggressively typing on her phone, ignoring the fact that she was the one who had caused this entire disaster by assaulting my wife in public. When the rideshare finally pulled up to the grand wrought iron gates of the Piedmont Elite Country Club, the guard at the booth hesitated. He was used to seeing imported luxury vehicles roll through, not a dented sedan. Vanessa had to roll down the window and scream her maiden name at the guard before he finally lifted the heavy gate. The club was a sprawling colonial-style estate surrounded by perfectly manicured golf courses and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It was a towering monument to old Southern wealth and white exclusivity. It was also a place where people who looked like me and Brandon were traditionally only allowed to enter through the service doors to carry trays of food. Brandon had always felt deeply uncomfortable here, but he had ignored that feeling because he wanted so desperately to fit into Vanessa's world. Now walking up the pristine white steps of the clubhouse in his wrinkled suit, he looked exactly like the outsider they had always considered him to be. Vanessa stormed through the heavy mahogany doors of the clubhouse, bypassing the greeting staff and marching directly toward the private dining terrace. Brandon followed closely behind his head, hung low in shame. Out on the terrace, the afternoon sun was shining brightly over the green golf course. Lawrence and Victoria were seated at their usual corner table under a large canvas umbrella. They were drinking expensive wine and laughing loudly with another wealthy white couple. When Lawrence saw his daughter approaching, his fake polite smile faltered. He noticed her disheveled appearance. He noticed the sheer panic burning in her eyes. Vanessa did not care that her parents were entertaining important guests. She walked right up to the table, grabbed an empty chair, and collapsed into it, breathing heavily. She told her parents that they needed to talk immediately in private. Lawrence excused himself, and Victoria followed them to a secluded lounge area deep inside the clubhouse. Brandon stood awkwardly by the doorway, feeling entirely out of place and completely powerless. Vanessa did not waste any time. She looked at her father and told him everything that had just happened in Mr. Sinclair's office. She explained that the $50 million trust fund was a complete illusion. She told them about the strict morality clause and how the medical report from the hospital had completely triggered my legal right to disinherit Brandon permanently. She confessed that Brandon was entirely cut off from the family fortune and that they were currently locked out of their luxury penthouse with no money to their name. Victoria's hand flew to her pearl necklace. Clutching it so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She gasped loudly, her eyes darting toward Brandon with a look of pure unadulterated horror. Lawrence stood perfectly still. The color slowly drained from his face as the crushing reality of his daughter's words washed over him. He had eagerly given his blessing to this marriage because he believed Brandon was the golden key to saving his own failing business empire. Lawrence was quietly drowning in $15 million of toxic corporate debt, and he had been banking on his new billionaire-in-laws to quietly bail him out to avoid a highly public bankruptcy. He had tolerated my family and smiled at my wife because he thought we were his financial salvation. Now he was looking at a son-in-law who was poorer than the waiters serving the terrace outside. The heavy silence in the private room was finally broken by Lawrence's cold, cruel laughter. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was the bitter, ugly sound of an arrogant man who realized he had been completely outplayed by someone he considered beneath him. Lawrence turned his gaze slowly toward Brandon. The mask of the progressive, tolerant white liberal completely evaporated in an instant. There was no more fake politeness. There was no more pretending that he respected Brandon as an equal man. Lawrence looked at my son with absolute sting disgust. He stepped closer to Brandon, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "You mean to tell me," Lawrence hissed, his voice dripping with venom, "that you are absolutely nothing? You paraded around my house, drinking my expensive scotch, asking for my daughter's hand in marriage, and you do not even own the suit on your back." Brandon tried to speak, but his voice cracked in his throat. He stammered, trying to explain that he did not know about the discretionary clause, that he honestly thought the money would eventually be his to control. But Lawrence did not want to hear pathetic apologies. Victoria stepped forward, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. She looked Brandon up and down as if he were a piece of rotting garbage that had blown into her pristine country club. "We let you into our family," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "We compromised our prestigious social standing to let a boy like you marry our daughter because you promised her a life of luxury, and now you expect us to clean up your financial mess. You are absolutely pathetic." The racial slurs came next. They did not shout them loudly enough for the other club members to hear. They did not need to. They delivered them with a quiet, casual cruelty that made them even more devastating to hear. Lawrence used horrible words that stripped away all of Brandon's basic dignity, reminding him exactly what this old money family truly thought of a black man without a massive bank account to shield him. Brandon stood there taking every insult, every racial epithet, every degrading comment without saying a single word to defend himself. He realized in that agonizing moment that Vanessa's family had never loved him. They had never even liked him. They had merely tolerated his skin color because it came attached to my black corporate credit card. The moment the credit card was declined, his humanity was completely revoked. It was a brutal, agonizing awakening for a boy who had spent his whole life trying to buy the respect of people who secretly despised him. Vanessa did not defend her husband. She did not tell her father to stop using those hateful, racist words. She simply sat in her chair, crying crocodile tears, feeling sorry for herself. Lawrence turned his attention back to his daughter, his eyes cold and calculating. He told Vanessa to wipe her face and stop acting like a child. He instructed her to take her diamond wedding ring off immediately. "You are not going to stay married to this useless street rat," Lawrence commanded, pointing a stiff, rigid finger at Brandon. "You are going to file for divorce first thing tomorrow morning. But we are not walking away from this empty-handed. Your arrogant father-in-law thinks he can play games with our family. He thinks he can embarrass us in front of the entire city, lock you out of a venue, and hide his money behind a piece of paper. He does not know who he is dealing with." Lawrence began to pace the floor of the private lounge, his arrogant confidence slowly returning to his posture. He promised his daughter that he would personally fund the most vicious corporate divorce attorneys in the entire state of Georgia. He vowed to file endless discovery motions to subpoena every single financial record my company had ever produced and to drag my corporate reputation through the mud. He told Vanessa that they would sue me for hiding marital assets, for emotional distress, and for anything else his expensive lawyers could possibly dream up. He swore that he would bleed me dry through relentless corporate litigation, until I was forced to offer a massive multi-million-dollar settlement just to make the public relations nightmare go away. He looked at Brandon one last time and told him to get out of the country club before he had the armed security guards throw him out by the back of his neck. Brandon turned around and walked out the door, leaving his wife behind without saying a single word. He was completely broken. While my son was being thrown out of the country club and Lawrence was busy plotting his grand legal war, I was sitting quietly in my private office, overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I had anticipated Lawrence's reaction perfectly. I knew that a desperate, arrogant man would choose to attack rather than retreat. I knew he would threaten to use his old money connections to destroy my business through the court system. What Lawrence did not know was that his old money was already completely gone. I poured myself a cup of dark black coffee and walked over to my heavy oak desk. My secure corporate iPad was sitting on the polished wood. The screen suddenly lit up with a high-priority notification from my shadow hedge fund manager. I picked up the device and read the single line of text on the bright screen. The trap had been perfectly primed. It was time to pull the secondary trigger and show Lawrence exactly who owned his world. Lawrence was a man who truly believed that his social status and his skin color made him completely bulletproof. After throwing my son out of the country club, he sat back down at the shaded table with his daughter. He ordered another glass of expensive gin and told Vanessa to wipe her tears. He promised her that the nightmare was over and that he was going to personally ensure her financial survival. He told her that he would hire the most ruthless corporate divorce attorneys in the state to tear my family apart. To prove his power, Lawrence pulled his expensive smartphone from his jacket pocket and opened his private banking application. He intended to transfer $500,000 directly into Vanessa's personal checking account. It was meant to be a swift down payment for a luxury condominium in the city and a retainer for the legal team. He typed the massive amount into the screen with absolute arrogant confidence and pressed the button to execute the wire transfer. He took a sip of his drink, waiting for the confirmation screen. Instead, a red error message flashed brightly across the glass. The notification simply read, "Insufficient funds in account frozen." Lawrence frowned in annoyance, assuming it was nothing more than a simple banking glitch. Men of his supposed caliber do not get error messages on their accounts. He immediately dialed the direct line to his personal wealth manager at the regional bank in Charleston. He fully expected the man to answer on the first ring with groveling apologies and an immediate fix, but the banker on the other end of the line did not apologize. His voice was shaking with pure panic. The manager informed Lawrence that the wire transfer was not blocked by a technical error. He explained that all corporate accounts, personal checking accounts, and emergency lines of credit tied to the family name were legally frozen by a direct court order. A primary creditor holding the massive debt for Lawrence's failing logistics company had just executed an emergency freeze on all assets, citing a critical breach of financial covenants. Lawrence felt the blood completely drain from his face. His hand trembled so violently that he dropped his crystal glass onto the patio floor. He ended the call without another word and stood up, leaving his daughter sitting alone at the table in confusion. He ran out of the country club, threw himself into his luxury car, and drove recklessly toward his corporate headquarters. While Lawrence was speeding down the highway in a blind panic, I was sitting comfortably in my quiet office, overlooking the Atlanta skyline, pouring myself a second cup of dark coffee. I had been waiting for this exact moment for 3 long months. When Brandon first brought Vanessa to our estate and proudly announced his engagement, my instincts immediately warned me that something was terribly wrong with her family. I did not smile and nod like a foolish old man eager for white validation. Instead, I hired the most thorough and ruthless private investigator in the state of Georgia. I paid him a massive premium to bypass the public records and dig deep into the pristine background of Vanessa's supposedly wealthy old money family. The investigator returned a week later with a goldmine of pathetic secrets. He uncovered a truth that was both hilariously tragic and incredibly useful for my long-term planning. The old money prestige that Lawrence and Victoria constantly bragged about at their country club dinners was nothing more than a carefully maintained mirage. Their massive ancestral mansion in Charleston was mortgaged to the absolute limit, but their real vulnerability lay in Lawrence's primary business. His regional logistics and trucking company had been quietly bleeding cash for the past 5 years. Lawrence was an arrogant man who refused to adapt to modern technology. He still ran his dispatch operations on outdated paper ledgers and refused to upgrade his decaying fleet of delivery trucks. To cover his massive operating losses and maintain his luxurious high society lifestyle, Lawrence had taken out incredibly toxic loans from various secondary banks. He had accumulated exactly $15 million in high-interest, short-term corporate debt. He was a man standing on a trap door with a heavy rope tied around his neck, just waiting for someone to pull the lever. I decided that I was going to be the man whose hand rested on that lever. I did not tell Brandon about my discovery because my son was too weak and would have ruined the plan. Instead, I called my shadow wealth manager and gave him a very specific set of instructions. We set up a proxy hedge fund registered in Delaware with absolutely zero public ties to my name or my real estate empire. Using this ghost entity, my manager aggressively approached the regional banks that held Lawrence's toxic loans. Those banks were absolutely desperate to get the failing debt off their books before the company officially filed for bankruptcy. They happily sold the debt to my Planksnung fund for pennies on the dollar without ever knowing who the real buyer was. Over the course of 3 quiet weeks, I successfully acquired total and absolute control over Lawrence's entire financial existence. By the time Vanessa put on her white dress and walked down the aisle, I was already the undisputed master of her family's fate. I became their largest and most dangerous creditor. Lawrence burst through the heavy glass doors of his corporate headquarters, completely out of breath. The building was aging and poorly maintained, a physical reflection of his failing leadership. He ran straight into the executive boardroom, where his chief financial officer was already sitting, surrounded by stacks of financial documents and looking entirely defeated. The officer looked up at Lawrence with pale, terrified eyes. He explained that an unknown Delaware hedge fund had just declared a total default on all their consolidated loans. The fund had legally frozen the operating accounts and was preparing to seize the physical assets of the company. The officer explained that they had effectively been cut off from their oxygen supply. The company could no longer make payroll. They could not buy fuel for their delivery trucks, and they could not even pay the mortgage on the Charleston family estate. Lawrence was absolutely furious. He relied heavily on his skin color and his privilege to bully people into submission. He believed that he could intimidate any corporate entity over the phone. He demanded the direct contact number for the hedge fund manager listed on the legal injunction. He ordered his financial officer to dial the number and put the call on speakerphone right there in the middle of the boardroom. Lawrence adjusted his expensive tie and cleared his throat. He fully intended to use his country club charm and empty promises to negotiate a grace period. He truly thought he could buy his way out of a $15 million crisis with a fake smile and a few arrogant demands. The phone rang twice before the line connected, but the call did not route to a busy corporate office in Delaware. The call was routed directly to the secure smartphone sitting right in front of me on my heavy oak desk in Atlanta. I picked up the device and listened to the heavy panic breathing echoing through the speaker. Lawrence barked his name with forced authority and demanded to know exactly who he was speaking to. He demanded that his corporate accounts be unfrozen, immediately threatening massive retaliatory lawsuits and claiming he had powerful political connections in the state government. He yelled that they had no right to freeze his assets without a formal hearing. I let him rant and scream for a full continuous minute. I let him completely exhaust his false authority and run out of breath. The silence on the secure line became heavy and terrifying. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth, deep, and entirely devoid of any emotion. I asked him a very simple question. I asked Lawrence if the expensive drinks at the Piedmont Elite Country Club were refreshing. I asked him if he still felt comfortable using racial slurs against a black man now that his bank accounts were empty. The silence that instantly filled his boardroom was absolute and chilling. I could practically hear his heart stop beating through the phone. Lawrence recognized my steady voice immediately. The arrogant white knight who had promised to destroy my family just an hour ago was now suddenly paralyzed by the terrifying realization of his own utter vulnerability. Lawrence began to stammer heavily. His brain simply could not process the catastrophic reality of the situation. He asked me how this was even possible. He asked what kind of illegal trick I was playing on his family. I told him very clearly that there were no tricks. I explained that while he was busy pretending to be a billionaire aristocrat, I was busy legally purchasing his entire reality. I informed him that the Delaware hedge fund did not exist and that I personally owned every single piece of toxic debt attached to his failing name. I told him that I owned the loans on his decaying trucks. I owned the mortgage on his corporate headquarters, and most importantly, I owned the deed to his precious ancestral mansion in Charleston. The realization completely broke him. His progressive mask, his aristocratic pride, his racist superiority, all of it crumbled into pathetic dust in a matter of seconds. He was completely at the mercy of the man he secretly despised. Lawrence started to beg. His voice cracked and whined like a beaten dog. He pleaded for a private meeting. He asked for a chance to sit down and discuss a reasonable payment plan like civilized men. I refused his request immediately. I told Lawrence that civilized men do not strike elderly women in the face, and they certainly do not call my son degrading names in a country club. I told him he lost the right to be treated with respect the moment he allowed his daughter to disrespect my wife. I did not raise my voice as I delivered the final devastating blow. I informed Lawrence that the original loan agreements he foolishly signed included a strict financial health clause. Because his company was now officially insolvent, I had the absolute legal right to call in the entire $15 million debt immediately. I issued a formal emergency margin call right there on the open phone line. I told Lawrence he had exactly 48 hours to wire $15 million in cash directly into my holding account. I promised him that if the money was not transferred in full by that exact deadline, I would execute a hostile corporate takeover without any hesitation. I swore that I would seize his logistics company, liquidate every single asset he possessed, and foreclose on the Charleston estate, leaving his entire arrogant family completely homeless. I hung up the phone, leaving Lawrence trapped in a silent room with his absolute destruction. The morning sun cast long, heavy shadows across the polished hardwood floor of my executive office. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. The city was a machine of endless motion, and I owned a significant portion of the gears that kept it turning. My secure phone sat quietly on the center of my desk. Exactly 12 hours had passed since I issued the $15 million margin call that legally froze the entire financial existence of my new in-laws. I knew Lawrence would not wait the full 48 hours. Men who have spent their entire lives pretending to be powerful are always the first to break when real power is finally applied to their necks. Right on cue, the intercom on my desk buzzed with a soft chime. My executive assistant informed me that a man was standing in the lobby demanding to see me. She noted that he looked highly agitated and was refusing to leave until he spoke with the chairman. I instructed her to let him up, but I told her to make him wait in the elevator hall for exactly 20 minutes before opening the heavy glass doors to my private suite. I wanted the cold reality of his situation to sink deep into his bones. I wanted him to stare at the expensive modern art and the silent marble walls of my empire and realize that he was nothing more than a beggar standing outside the gates. When the glass doors finally opened, Lawrence practically stumbled into my office. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant white aristocrat who had stood in the country club less than a day ago, barking racial slurs and threatening to destroy my legacy, was completely gone. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His tie was pulled loose and the top button of his collar was ripped open. His face was pale and covered in a thick layer of nervous perspiration. His hands shook violently as he clutched a leather briefcase to his chest as if it were a shield. He stopped a few feet away from my desk, breathing heavily. He looked around the massive room, taking in the sheer scale of the wealth he had foolishly tried to challenge. I did not offer him a seat. I did not offer him a glass of water. I simply remained standing behind my desk, folding my hands together and waiting for him to speak. Lawrence swallowed hard and tried to stand up straight, attempting to summon whatever tiny fraction of old money dignity he had left. He opened his mouth, but the booming, confident voice he used to command his country club friends had completely vanished. Instead, a pathetic, trembling whisper came out. He addressed me by my first name, trying to force a sense of familiar equality that absolutely did not exist. He told me that there had been a terrible misunderstanding between our families. He blamed the stress of the wedding and the emotional toll of the day for the harsh words he had used against my son. He actually tried to smile, a sickly, desperate expression that made him look even more pathetic. He took a step closer and placed his hands flat on my desk. He begged me to look at the situation reasonably. He explained that his logistics company employed hundreds of people and that calling in the $15 million loan immediately would force him into total liquidation. He talked about his ancestral home in Charleston, the estate that had been in his family for 4 generations. He told me that if the bank foreclosed on that property, his wife would have a nervous breakdown and his social standing would be permanently destroyed. He pleaded with me, man to man, to extend the grace period on the loan. He promised to pay me back every single cent with maximum interest if I just gave him 6 months to restructure his failing business. I let him talk. I let him spill his desperate excuses and his empty promises all over my desk. I watched him throw away every ounce of his supposed aristocratic superiority just to save his own skin. When he finally ran out of words, he stood there panting, waiting for me to show him the mercy he had so brutally denied my family. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single trace of anger or vindictive joy. The most terrifying thing a powerful man can do is remain completely empty of emotion. I looked Lawrence directly in the eyes and told him that his logistics company was a rotting corpse and his family legacy was an illusion built on debt. I told him that $15 million was the amount of money my holding company generates in a single fiscal quarter. The money meant absolutely nothing to me, but I knew it was the only oxygen keeping him alive. I informed him that I was not going to forgive the debt. I was not going to give him a 6-month extension. However, I told him I would halt the immediate liquidation of his company and stop the foreclosure on his Charleston estate under one very specific and non-negotiable condition. Lawrence's eyes widened with a desperate glimmer of hope. He nodded aggressively, telling me he would agree to absolutely anything. He said he would sign over company shares or give me a seat on his board of directors. He was completely willing to sell his soul to keep his superficial lifestyle intact. I shook my head slowly. I told him I did not want his failing company, and I certainly did not want to sit in a room with his racist friends. I told him the price of his financial survival was his daughter. Lawrence froze, the color completely draining from his face once again. I laid out the absolute terms of the cold deal. I told him that within the next 24 hours, Vanessa was going to sit down in front of a high-definition camera. She was going to record a new video and post it to every single social media platform she possessed. In that video, she was going to publicly confess that her previous claims were complete lies. She was going to admit to the entire world that she snorted cocaine in the bridal suite, that she married my son solely to exploit his supposed trust fund, and that she was the one who violently assaulted my 74-year-old wife in an unprovoked attack. But the public confession was only the first half of the ultimatum. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents my corporate lawyers had prepared that very morning. I dropped the heavy papers onto the desk with a loud thud. I told Lawrence that after Vanessa posted the video, she was going to sign these exact papers. It was a comprehensive legal annulment and a total waiver of marital rights. The document stated that Vanessa acknowledged the marriage was contracted under fraudulent pretenses. It stripped her of any legal right to claim spousal support alimony or any division of assets whatsoever. She would leave the marriage with exactly what she brought into it, which was absolutely nothing. I looked Lawrence up and down, observing the profound moral cowardice hiding behind his expensive suit. I told him that if Vanessa executed the public confession and signed the annulment without a single modification, I would restructure his $15 million corporate debt into a manageable 10-year payment plan. He would keep his company and he would keep his precious mansion. But if she refused, or if he tried to negotiate a single comma on those legal papers, I would press the button and wipe his entire bloodline off the financial map before the sun went down. The choice was incredibly simple, but devastatingly cruel. Lawrence had to choose between his own financial survival and his daughter's public destruction. If he forced her to confess, Vanessa would face severe legal consequences and total social exile. Her reputation would be permanently ruined. But if he protected her, he would lose his wealth, his status, and his home. I watched the internal battle play out across his sweating face. It lasted exactly 10 seconds. Old money greed is a cancer that destroys loyalty. Lawrence did not argue. He did not try to defend his daughter or protect her future. He simply reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the thick stack of annulment papers toward his chest. He looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes and promised me that the video would be posted by noon and the signed papers would be delivered to my lawyer by the end of the day. He turned around and practically ran out of my office, holding the legal documents like a lifeline. I watched him stumble into the elevator, a broken and pathetic man who was rushing off to turn his own family camp into a war zone. He was going to walk into that cheap motel room and force his spoiled daughter to swallow her own poison. The enemy was no longer fighting me. They were now fighting each other for scraps of survival. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and took a deep breath. The corporate execution had been carried out flawlessly. I packed up my briefcase and told my assistant to cancel my afternoon meetings. I wanted to go home to my wife. I wanted to sit in my quiet garden and drink iced tea, knowing that the cancer had been completely cut out of our lives. My driver took me back to the secure gated estate in Buckhead. The afternoon was warm and peaceful. Eleanor was sitting on the back patio reading a book. Her cheek was still bandaged, but the stress had completely faded from her beautiful face. We sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the birds and watching the sun slowly begin to set. We thought the worst of the storm had passed. We thought the legal mechanisms I had set in motion were simply running their natural course. But just as the sky began to turn a deep shade of orange, the heavy iron gates at the front of our estate buzzed loudly. My head of security rushed out to the patio, his face tight with concern. He informed me that law enforcement had just arrived at the perimeter. I stood up, adjusting my suit jacket. I assumed Lawrence had done something incredibly foolish, like calling the police to report a financial crime or trying to claim extortion. I walked calmly through the massive house to the front entrance, expecting to quickly dismiss a confused patrol officer. I pulled the heavy mahogany front door open. Standing on my front porch were two serious-looking police detectives wearing plain clothes and carrying official leather badges on their belts. Their unmarked vehicle was idling in my circular driveway. I looked at the lead detective and asked him how I could help the Atlanta Police Department. This evening, the detective did not smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of official court paper. He looked me right in the eye and stated that he was serving an active felony arrest warrant. My heart beat a fraction faster, but I kept my face perfectly still. I asked him what the charges were. The detective read from the paper, stating the charges were felony elder abuse and filing a false police report. But as he unfolded the document and held it out for me to see, I realized the absolute brilliance of what was happening. The warrant was not for me, and it was not for my son. The police had come to my house looking for the bride. The evening air was cooling down, but the tension on my doorstep was thick and heavy. I looked at the lead detective standing on my front porch. He was a tall man with graying hair and a tired expression. His partner was younger and held a small leather notebook. The lead detective told me that he was not there to arrest me, but he had a legal obligation to investigate a very serious formal complaint that had just been filed. He explained that my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, had walked into a police precinct just 3 hours ago. She had sworn under oath and filed a formal police report, claiming that I had hired armed thugs to intimidate her and her family. Vanessa was truly a fascinating creature of pure delusion. She had realized that her viral social media video was not enough to force my hand. She realized that her father was failing and that she was legally tied to a penniless man. So she decided to double down on her victimhood. She reached into the oldest and most venomous playbook in American history. She decided to weaponize the police against a wealthy black man. She thought her tears and her fragile white aesthetic would automatically make her the victim in the eyes of the law. She thought the police would break down my doors, drag me out in handcuffs, and force me to settle her massive lawsuit just to avoid a criminal trial. I did not act offended. I did not raise my voice or accuse the detectives of racism. When you know you hold the absolute truth in your hands, you do not need to be defensive. I simply stepped back and opened my heavy mahogany front door wider. I invited the detectives to step inside my home. I told them that the evening chill was setting in and that it was much better to discuss these serious allegations over a fresh cup of coffee. The younger detective looked surprised by my calm demeanor, but the older detective simply nodded and stepped over the threshold. I led them through the grand foyer of my estate. Their heavy boots echoed softly against the polished marble floors. I guided them into my private study, a large room lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and filled with the scent of old paper and expensive leather. I asked them to take a seat on the comfortable leather sofa opposite my massive desk. I walked over to a small silver serving tray sitting on a side table. I poured 3 cups of dark roasted coffee from a thermal carafe. I handed a cup to each detective and sat down in my high-backed chair. I took a slow sip of my coffee and asked them to tell me exactly what my daughter-in-law had claimed. The older detective pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. It was a copy of her sworn affidavit. He read it aloud. Vanessa claimed that shortly after being forced out of the country club, she and Brandon had returned to their cheap motel. She alleged that 2 large unidentified men had banged aggressively on their motel door, claiming to work for me. She stated that these men possessed firearms and had threatened to cause her severe bodily harm if she did not immediately drop her $10 million lawsuit. Furthermore, she doubled down on her original lie. She swore under penalty of perjury that Eleanor had brutally attacked her in the bridal suite, and that the incident in the ballroom was merely her trying to defend herself from a violent elderly woman. It was a brilliantly constructed lie designed to trigger an immediate and aggressive police response. She painted me as a mob boss and her as an innocent hostage. The younger detective watched my face closely, waiting for a reaction. He was waiting for me to panic or to aggressively deny the charges. I placed my coffee cup down on the wooden coaster resting on my desk. I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, genuine sigh. I told the detectives that it is a profound tragedy when the legal system is manipulated by a desperate person trying to hide their own criminal behavior. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I reached inside and pulled out a small, sleek silver USB drive. I placed it gently on the center of the dark wood surface. I looked at the lead detective and explained that my real estate empire is built on absolute security. I told him that I do not simply rent out luxury venues. I own them entirely. And because I host events for some of the most powerful corporate entities in the world, every single square inch of my properties is equipped with state-of-the-art, military-grade surveillance technology. I explained that the cameras do not just record high-definition video, but they also capture crystal-clear enhanced audio. I picked up the remote control from my desk and pointed it at the wall opposite the leather sofa. A massive flat-screen monitor seamlessly descended from a hidden panel in the ceiling. I stood up, picked up the silver USB drive, and walked over to the media console. I plugged the drive into the port and selected the primary video file. I turned back to the detectives and told them that I did not hire any thugs to visit Vanessa at her motel. I explained that I had absolutely no reason to intimidate her, because I already possessed everything necessary to send her to prison. I pressed play on the remote control. The massive screen flickered to life, displaying the raw 4K resolution footage from the luxury bridal suite. The quality was so pristine it looked like a high-budget cinema production. The detectives sat forward in their seats, their coffee cups completely forgotten. The video clearly showed Vanessa sitting at the expensive vanity mirror, surrounded by her bridesmaids. The enhanced audio picked up every single word. The detectives heard Vanessa snorting cocaine through a rolled-up $100 bill. They heard her boastful, malicious laughter. They heard her explicitly detail her fraudulent plan to marry Brandon solely to divorce him a year later and steal half of his supposed $50 million trust fund. The older detective frowned, pulling out a pen and beginning to take rapid notes. But the video was not over. The footage showed the exact moment my wife, Eleanor opened the door and walked into the suite. The cameras captured the quiet dignity of my wife as she placed the velvet jewelry box on the table. The audio captured her firm but polite request for Vanessa to leave the estate immediately to avoid a public scandal over her drug use. The footage clearly showed that Eleanor never raised her hand, never raised her voice, and never made a single threatening gesture. It showed Vanessa panicking, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred as she realized her massive payday was evaporating. I paused the video and looked at the detectives. I told them that the bridal suite was just the prologue. I switched to the second file, which contained the synchronized feeds from the grand ballroom. The screen split into 4 different camera angles, providing a complete and undeniable view of the entire wedding reception. The video showed Eleanor standing quietly near the edge of the dance floor, holding a glass of cider. Then it showed Vanessa marching aggressively across the marble floor, pushing past her own guests with violent intent. The detectives watched in absolute silence as the hide camera zoomed in on the confrontation. There was no ambiguity. There was no blurry movement or obstructed view. The video clearly captured Vanessa raising her hand and delivering a brutal, unprovoked slap directly to my wife's face. The audio caught the sharp, sickening crack of skin hitting skin, followed by the sound of Eleanor's expensive glasses shattering against the floor. The microphone suspended above the chandelier perfectly captured Vanessa screaming her venomous command to get out of here, old woman. But the most damning piece of evidence came just a few seconds later. As I was kneeling on the floor, wiping the blood from my wife's cheek, the camera captured Vanessa turning to her mother, Victoria, at the VIP table. The enhanced audio isolated Vanessa's voice over the panicked murmurs of the crowd. The detectives clearly heard Vanessa whisper to her mother that she was going to call the police and claim the old attacked her first so they could sue me for millions. It was premeditated, malicious, and entirely undeniable. I pressed the stop button on the remote control. The massive screen went completely black. The sudden silence in my study was heavy and absolute. I walked back to my desk and sat down in my leather chair. I picked up my coffee cup and took another slow sip. I looked at the 2 men sitting on my sofa. They were seasoned law enforcement officers who had likely seen every type of liar and manipulator the city of Atlanta had to offer, but they were visibly stunned by the sheer brazen audacity of the young white woman who had just sat in their precinct and lied to their faces. The older detective closed his leather notebook and let out a long, slow breath. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the black screen. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a slam-dunk felony conviction wrapped in a neat digital package. In the state of Georgia, filing a false police report is a serious crime. Perjury is a crime. Possession of a Schedule I narcotic is a crime. An unprovoked battery against a 74-year-old woman is a severe felony that carries mandatory prison time. Vanessa had tried to use the police department as her personal weapon to terrorize my family. She had sworn under oath that I was a violent criminal, but all she had actually done was dig her own grave and invite the police to push her right into it. She had handed me the exact tool I needed to destroy her completely and legally. The lead detective stood up from the leather sofa. His demeanor had completely shifted. The subtle tension and suspicion he had carried into my home were entirely gone, replaced by a cold, professional determination. He looked at me and apologized for the intrusion. He formally requested to take the silver USB drive as official state evidence. I nodded and told him that he was more than welcome to keep it. The younger detective stood up beside his partner. He looked almost embarrassed that they had even entertained Vanessa's ridiculous story. The lead detective reached down to his belt and pulled out his black police radio. He pressed the transmit button and called directly into his precinct dispatch. His voice was loud and clear, echoing off the mahogany walls of my quiet study. He informed dispatch that the intimidation complaint filed by Vanessa was entirely fabricated. He formally requested that the investigation into my family be closed immediately. But he did not stop there. He instructed dispatch to locate a judge right now to sign an emergency arrest warrant. The target of their investigation had just drastically changed, and the hunters were now heading straight for the motel. The wheels of justice move incredibly slow for the poor, but they move with terrifying speed when a billionaire provides high-definition evidence of a felony. Just 20 minutes after the detectives walked out of my quiet study, an emergency arrest warrant was signed by a district court judge. The hunters were dispatched immediately, but Vanessa was not hiding in her cheap motel room. She was entirely incapable of laying low. Her extreme narcissism required a constant audience to validate her delusions. She had taken a rideshare back to the Piedmont Elite Country Club, the very same place where her bankrupt father had threatened my son just a day earlier. It was the absolute peak of the lunch hour. The private outdoor dining terrace was packed to capacity with wealthy socialites drinking expensive champagne and picking at tiny portions of gourmet food. Vanessa was sitting at a premium shaded table surrounded by her high society friends. She was holding court. She was playing the role of the traumatized bride to absolute perfection. She wiped fake tears from her eyes as she recounted the horrific lies she had sworn to in her formal police report. She told her friends that my wife was a violent monster who had attacked her out of pure jealousy. She told them that I was a dangerous mafia boss who had sent armed thugs to terrorize her in the middle of the night. Her friends gasped and patted her hand, offering their empty sympathies and validating her racist delusions. Vanessa was basking in the golden glow of their attention. She truly believed that that very moment, police officers were kicking down the heavy doors of my estate to drag me away in handcuffs. She took a slow sip of her mimosa, feeling completely untouchable and entirely superior to my family. She did not notice the heavy silence that suddenly began spreading across the dining terrace. The quiet clinking of expensive silverware and the soft hum of classical music abruptly stopped. Two plainclothes police detectives walked right through the grand mahogany doors of the clubhouse and stepped out onto the sunlit terrace. They did not stop at the host stand to check in. They did not ask for permission to enter the private club. They walked with the heavy, undeniable authority of the law. The wealthy patrons stared in absolute shock. The presence of law enforcement in their exclusive sanctuary was an incredibly rare and highly offensive sight. The older detective scanned the tables until his sharp eyes locked onto Vanessa. He and his partner walked directly toward her table, their heavy boots thudding loudly against the polished stone floor. Vanessa, finally, noticed them approaching. A massive, triumphant smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. She put down her crystal glass and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer dress. She looked at her friends with the incredibly smug expression, assuming the detectives had come to personally deliver the good news of my arrest to her table. She extended her hand, playing the role of the gracious, grateful victim. She thanked the officers for coming so quickly and asked them if the dangerous old man was finally in custody. The older detective did not take her hand. He did not smile. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from her and looked her right in the eye with absolute disgust. He asked her to confirm her full legal name. Vanessa frowned, slightly confused by his cold, professional tone, but she proudly stated her name, expecting to be treated like royalty. The detective nodded slowly. He reached down and unclipped the heavy, solid metal handcuffs from his leather belt. The loud metallic clack echoed across the completely silent dining terrace. The detective did not lower his voice to spare her fragile feelings. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring that every single wealthy aristocrat on that terrace heard exactly what he had to say. He told Vanessa that she was under arrest. He listed the charges one by one, letting the heavy words hang in the warm air. Felony elder abuse, filing a false police report, perjury, possession of a Schedule I narcotic. The smug, triumphant smile completely vanished from Vanessa's face, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated terror. Her wealthy friends gasped and pushed their heavy chairs back, physically distancing themselves from her as if she had a contagious disease. Vanessa began to stammer rapidly, shaking her head and waving her manicured hands. She told the detectives there was a terrible mistake. She reminded them of her sworn statement, claiming she was the real victim in this nightmare. The younger detective stepped forward and grabbed her left wrist tightly. He told her there was no mistake and that they had already watched the high-definition 4K security footage from the bridal suite and the grand ballroom. That single sentence broke her completely. She realized the raw, unedited truth was now in the hands of the police, and her elaborate web of lies had entirely collapsed. The elegant, sophisticated Southern belle completely evaporated into thin air. Vanessa began to scream. It was not a delicate cry for help. It was the harsh, ugly shriek of a cornered rat realizing the steel trap had finally snapped shut over its neck. She tried to pull her arm away, but the detective easily overpowered her. He twisted her arms roughly behind her back and locked the cold steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The older detective began reading her Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice. "You have the right to remain silent." But Vanessa was entirely incapable of remaining silent. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the stone floor. She screamed for her father to save her. She screamed for her friends to do something, to call their expensive lawyers to stop this absolute madness. But her friends just sat there, staring at her in absolute shock and disgust. Nobody wanted to be associated with a hysterical woman who assaulted the elderly, snorted cocaine, and lied to the police. The detectives did not show an ounce of pity for her wealthy background. They grabbed her firmly by the arms and forcefully marched her through the exact center of the dining terrace. It was the ultimate public humiliation, designed to strip away her fake prestige. The wealthy elite of Atlanta watched in absolute silence as the supposed princess of Charleston was paraded through the country club looking like a feral animal. Her expensive designer dress was twisted. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess, and black mascara was running heavily down her cheeks. She kicked and sobbed, begging the officers to let her go, claiming she was from a good family and did not belong in a dirty jail cell. They ignored her desperate pleas. They pushed her through the mahogany doors, dragging her out of the luxurious clubhouse and into the bright, harsh sunlight of the front parking lot. Brandon was standing in the parking lot, having just arrived in another cheap rideshare vehicle. He had come to the club to beg Vanessa for forgiveness, to try and somehow salvage his broken, pathetic marriage. He thought he could apologize and fix things. But as he stepped out of the battered sedan, he froze completely. He watched the heavy glass doors of the clubhouse burst open. He watched two large detectives drag his screaming wife out into the parking lot. He listened to her, swearing and thrashing, sounding absolutely deranged, the pristine, flawless image of the aristocratic white woman he had blindly idolized completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He finally saw her for exactly what she was. She was a vicious, manipulative criminal who had thrown away everything for her own toxic greed. He stood paralyzed behind a parked car, watching as the detectives shoved her forcefully into the back of an unmarked police cruiser. They slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off her hysterical screams. The cruiser sped out of the country club parking lot, leaving a heavy cloud of dust floating in the air. Brandon stood entirely alone in the quiet parking lot, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. His entire world had been completely dismantled in less than 24 hours. He slowly walked toward the entrance of the clubhouse, not knowing what to do or where to go next. As he approached the wide stone steps, one of Vanessa's wealthy friends walked out the door, looking deeply uncomfortable. The woman was holding Vanessa's expensive, leather designer purse, which had been left behind on the dining chair during the chaotic, violent arrest. The woman shoved the purse hard into Brandon's chest without saying a single word and quickly walked away, avoiding his gaze entirely. Brandon stood there holding the heavy leather bag. He looked down at it, feeling completely hollow and defeated. The purse was completely unzipped. Sitting right on top of her expensive makeup was Vanessa's smartphone. The screen suddenly lit up with an incoming message notification. Because she had been actively texting her friends, when the police arrived, the phone had not locked. It was completely open and vulnerable. Brandon stared at the glowing screen. The message on the display was from a man he did not recognize. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into the purse and pulled the unlocked device out into the bright sunlight. Brandon stood completely alone in the sweltering heat of the country club parking lot, holding the heavy designer purse. The luxurious world he thought he belonged to was moving on without him. Wealthy patrons were walking to their expensive cars, completely ignoring the broken man standing on the asphalt. He looked down at the glowing screen of Vanessa's unlocked smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. He needed to get away from the staring eyes of the valet drivers and the whispering country club staff. Having absolutely no money for another rideshare, he swallowed the last tiny fraction of his pride and dialed a number he had not called in over 2 years. He called Gerald, an old college roommate. Gerald was a man Brandon had completely cut out of his life because Vanessa had deemed him too working-ass and too black to fit into their carefully curated high society aesthetic. 20 agonizing minutes later, a beat-up silver Honda pulled into the pristine circular driveway of the club. Its engine sputtered loudly, and the front bumper was heavily dented. It was a massive eyesore against the backdrop of imported luxury vehicles. Brandon opened the passenger door and collapsed into the worn fabric seat. Gerald did not ask any questions. He took one look at Brandon's ruined tailored suit and the hollow, devastated expression on his face and simply put the car in drive. As they pulled out of the elite neighborhood and headed toward the busy downtown connector, Brandon looked down at the phone in his hands. The device was still completely unlocked. The notification that had caught his eye was a message from an unsaved number. Brandon opened the messaging application and his eyes immediately locked onto a long thread of conversations. There was no name attached to the contact, but there was a profile picture. It was a handsome, wealthy-looking white man holding a glass of whiskey on a yacht. Brandon recognized him instantly. It was Tristan, one of the groomsmen from the wedding. Tristan was a man who came from the same bankrupt aristocratic circle as Vanessa's family. He was the man Vanessa had always claimed was just a close childhood friend. Brandon clicked on the conversation thread. He started to read the messages. The words glowing on the bright digital screen were sharp and incredibly violent. They cut through the thick, suffocating air of the hot car like a razor blade. Brandon scrolled up reading messages that had been sent just hours before the wedding ceremony. He read messages that had been sent during their supposed romantic dinners over the past 6 months. He read every single toxic secret his new wife had been hiding behind her flawless smile. Vanessa did not love him. She had never loved him for a single second. Her messages to Tristan were filled with absolute pure disgust for Brandon and for my entire family. She referred to Brandon as a pathetic, obedient dog. She typed that she could barely stand to let him touch her, but she had to play the part to secure the bag. She laughed in her messages about how incredibly naive Brandon was, how he believed every single lie she told him. Simply because she had blonde hair and a prestigious last name. She mocked the way he dressed, the way he spoke, and the desperate way he craved the approval of her racist parents. But the insults were not even the most devastating part of the digital archive. As Brandon scrolled further back, he discovered the exact blueprint of her malicious financial conspiracy. Vanessa and Tristan had planned the entire marriage together. Tristan had recommended a shady corporate lawyer who specialized in exploiting wealthy trust funds. Vanessa explained the plan in explicit detail across dozens of text messages. She wrote that she only needed to endure being married to the stupid black heir for exactly 6 months. She detailed how she would use the prenuptial agreement loophole, hide her dissipation of marital assets, and use the state community property laws to trigger a massive divorce settlement. She bragged to her lover that she was going to walk away with $25 million in tax-free cash. She promised Tristan that as soon as the ink was dry on the divorce papers, she would buy them a villa in the south of France, and they would never have to work a single day in their lives. She even sent Tristan a picture of herself trying on her custom wedding dress, with a caption that read, "Putting on my work uniform to go rob the bank." Sitting in the passenger seat of that beat-up Honda, my son finally experienced a total psychological collapse. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. His chest heaved as if he were suffocating. The reality of his absolute stupidity crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing building. He stared out the window at the past city streets, but he could not see anything through the heavy tears that finally began to fall from his eyes. He realized in that agonizing moment that everything he had thrown away was for an absolute mirage. A reel of devastating memories began to play rapidly in his mind. He remembered the exact moment in the grand ballroom when Vanessa raised her hand and struck his mother. He remembered looking down at his expensive shoes while Eleanor bled on the marble floor. He had chosen to protect his wife because he believed she represented his golden ticket to high society acceptance. He had traded the unconditional love of the parents who built a massive empire for him, all for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a naive, disposable payday. He remembered the countless times I had tried to warn him. He remembered the nights I sat him down in my study trying to teach him about the ruthless nature of the real estate business and the dangerous people who only pretend to be your friend when you have money. I had spent 28 years trying to build a fortress around him to protect him from the very predators he had eagerly invited into our home. And he had repaid my lifelong dedication by publicly humiliating us, by defending a violent racist, and by spitting on the legacy I poured my blood and sweat into creating. The crushing guilt and profound shame were almost too much for his physical body to handle. He dropped the smartphone onto the floorboard of the car, unable to look at the hateful words for another second. He bent over, burying his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed through the small enclosed space of the vehicle. His friend Gerald kept his eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel tightly, giving Brandon the silent space to completely fall apart. There was no comfort to be offered. There was no silver lining. Brandon was a man who had burned down his own castle, just to please a woman who was holding the match. He had lost his $50 million trust fund. He had lost his luxury penthouse. He had lost his corporate credit cards and his prestigious status in the local elite social circles. But none of those financial losses compared to the true tragedy of his situation. He had lost his father and his mother. He had permanently severed the only genuine bond of love and protection he had ever known. He was completely alone in the world, a penniless man chained to a disgraced criminal who was currently sitting in a jail cell. As Brandon wept in the passenger seat, the heavy, suffocating humidity of the Atlanta afternoon finally broke. The sky above the city began to darken rapidly. Massive charcoal gray clouds rolled in, blocking out the warm sunshine and casting a dark, ominous shadow over the entire skyline. The temperature dropped significantly in a matter of minutes. A sudden, violent gust of wind shook the small car, rattling the windows and blowing debris across the highway. Then the rain began to fall. It was not a gentle southern shower. It was a massive torrential thunderstorm. The heavy raindrops hit the metal roof of the Honda, sounding like thousands of tiny hammers. A brilliant flash of lightning tore across the dark sky, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. The storm was a perfect reflection of the absolute chaos and destruction that had consumed his life over the past 24 hours. Brandon slowly lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were red and swollen, his face wet with tears. He looked out the passenger window, watching the heavy rain wash down the glass, blurring the lights of the city. A desperate, irrational thought began to take root in his broken mind. He believed that if he could just see me face to face, if he could just explain the depth of Vanessa's betrayal and show me the text messages on the phone, I would magically forgive him. He wanted to revert to being a little boy running back to his father to fix his massive mistakes. He completely forgot the cold, unforgiving look in my eyes when I walked out of the corporate boardroom. He forgot the absolute finality of the morality clause. He wiped his face with the back of his trembling hand and sat up straight in the seat. He turned to Gerald. His voice was hoarse and broken, barely audible over the sound of the pouring rain and the roaring engine of the old car. He told his friend to change directions. He told Gerald to get off the downtown connector and head north. He gave him the exact address of my private gated estate in Buckhead. Gerald looked at him with deep concern, warning him that showing up unannounced in the middle of a massive thunderstorm after everything that had happened was a terrible idea. But Brandon refused to listen. He pleaded with his friend, telling him it was a matter of life and death. He needed to go home. He needed to stand in front of the man he had betrayed and beg for a salvation that no longer existed. The beat-up silver Honda took the next exit, its tires slipping slightly on the wet asphalt, and drove directly into the heart of the raging storm, heading straight for my iron gates. The torrential thunderstorm that had swallowed the city of Atlanta was showing no signs of stopping. The heavy, relentless rain battered the slate roof of my Buckhead estate, sounding like a continuous rolling drumbeat. Jagged forks of bright lightning flashed across the dark evening sky, violently illuminating the towering ancient oak trees that surrounded my massive property. At the end of my long, winding cobblestone driveway stood the heavy wrought iron gates. They were a towering physical barrier specifically designed to separate my peaceful sanctuary from the chaotic and demanding world outside. I was sitting in my dimly lit study, listening to the violent storm rattle the thick glass windows when the primary security monitor on my massive mahogany desk suddenly flared to life. The hidden motion sensors at the front gate had been triggered by an approaching vehicle. I leaned forward in my high-backed leather chair and looked closely at the high-definition screen. I watched a battered silver sedan slowly pull up and stop just inches away from the heavy black iron bars. The passenger door opened and a figure stepped out into the freezing, blinding downpour. It was Brandon. He did not have an umbrella or a heavy coat to protect himself from the elements. He was wearing the exact same ruined designer suit he had worn to the country club earlier that afternoon. The heavy rain instantly soaked through the expensive thin fabric, pressing it flat against his shivering skin and ruining his expensive leather shoes in the deep puddles forming on the asphalt. He walked unsteadily toward the towering iron gates, gripping the wet, slick metal bars with both of his bare hands.